All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for making it. My name is Charl. Work for a company called SensePost. We're a South African pen testing operation. We're owned by a business called Secure Data here in the UK. I work for Secure Data now, and I run a security intelligence and threat detection unit within Secure Data. My talk this morning is called Bad Analogies Make Bad Realities, and the subtitle is, Are We Sitting on a Security Debt Crisis? That's my Twitter handle. Being a South African, I'm trying very hard to catch up with Elon Musk and Mark Shuttleworth in terms of Twitter followers. My mom and my wife aren't on Twitter, so I need all the help I can get. If you participate in Twitter, then take a moment to follow me up. I've uploaded the slides onto G Drive. So if you're taking photos, you can make a note of the URL. You can download it and follow along. The slides are quite content heavy, and I won't be going into all of the details. So it's if the topic captures your interest, and it's probably worth downloading that and having a look. All right. So why this talk? Well, back in 2016, while we were talking about hacking internet-connected sex toys, Russian hackers targeting the US changed the world, I think, in quite a substantial way. Not only did they have the gumption to try to affect and possibly actually affect the outcome of a democratic election in a free country, but they spawned an entire new phase, an entire new era, I believe, in our industry. And we'll all know the sort of major events, Eternal Blue, WannaCry, NotPetya. Those were all events in our industry that emerged directly as a consequence of Russian government hacking and US offensive cyber operations. And I think it significantly upped the game for us, significantly changed what it is that we're dealing with. And it happened on our watch. It was something that happened in our industry during our time. And so I think today we're looking at a world that's completely different to the world that we knew before. There's a threat emerging that has the potential to fundamentally change the world as we know it. And I'm not just talking about our own security, the security of our own technology and our own personal privacy, or even the security of the businesses and the organizations that we work for. I'm talking about our families, the people we know and love, the society that we operate in. Those things have the potential to be changed in very substantial ways over the next few years, directly as a result of what's happening in the security space. And that can work out in good ways. Good things can emerge from that, or bad things can emerge from that. But very certainly, things are going to change, and they're going to change in real and significant ways. And if you're sitting in this room, or you're sitting next door, or you're sleeping off a hangover from last night, then like it or not, you're a part of that battle that's started. You're at the front of a war that I think is going to shape our world over the next few years in a very substantial way. And so we're all participants. We're all shaping it through the things that we do, the things that we say, the decisions that we make. And so it's very much up to us to determine how the world is going to shape out over the next few years. And I think there's a call to action here in that we as security practitioners need to step up to this challenge, recognize that we're not in Kansas anymore. This is not kindergarten. It's not just fun and games. But what we do really matters, and it matters in a very fundamental and, as I said, in a societal way. And I think that stepping up requires for us as practitioners to start out on a journey of maturity, a kind of a process of growing up in which we rethink about what we do and how we do it. And moving from where many of us are today as kind of solitary operators that do what we have to do in our own space, to a place where we can be genuinely significant, genuinely impact society and the world. And I think there's a number of phases on that journey. You know, we start off being solitary operators, and in that space we need to improve and work on our own performance. We need to become excellent at what we do. Genuine experts, people who really know what we talk about. Think, research, study, learn, practice. We need to progress from there to developing process that allows us to be sustainable, allows what we do to be repeated, not only by ourselves but also by others. We need to make it simple for others to reproduce what we do, and we do that by producing tools, white papers, blog posts, participating at conferences like this. Then we need to make it scalable, which means that it can be done by others beyond ourselves, right, at a larger scale. And that involves investing in people, empowering other people to be as good as we are at what we do. And then we need to move from there, I believe, to be being taken seriously in the places that we work and in the industries that we operate in. And I think we do that by being able to accurately express purpose. Why is security important? Why does one decision better than another decision? Why can this trade-off not be accepted? What is the return on investment? Being able to handle those things, being able to express those things will allow us to be taken seriously in the spaces that we work. And then beyond that, I think we need to start impacting society by developing the ability to express purpose and principles, and by that I mean the why of security. Why is privacy important in today's world? Why is security important in today's world? Why does it matter that these things are done right? And then finally, I think once we've mastered that, we can emerge at a point where we can really affect policy at the highest levels. The decisions that government makes, the priorities that they have, at all levels can be affected. And then at that point, I believe we can be significant. And as I said, I think this is a call to arms for us. I think this is something that we should all put on our roadmaps for ourselves, to move out of the space where we're sort of playing around with things that are interesting and fun for us, to get to a place where we're really affecting the way the world thinks about the decisions we make. Now, on this journey, there's a large part of it that you can still do on your own. You can operate in isolation. You can talk to yourself. You can work from your office or from your home. But if we really want to move up that trajectory, we have to get to the point where we can express our thoughts and our ideas and our principles in clear language that other people can understand. Starting at the board, we need to be able to explain why security is important, using terms and analogies and a vernacular that the people we're communicating with can understand. And so a big part of my thesis in my presentation this morning is to express the idea that metaphors matter. So the vernacular that we use when we talk about what we do changes the way we think about what we do and the way that other people think about what we do. And I want to give you a simple example that I really like when I'm talking to people. There's an analogy, a metaphor that emerges from Africa, where we're from, about the gazelle who lives in the African bush. And the gazelle, when she wakes up in the morning, knows that she has to start running. She has to get up and she has to start running because she's running away from a predator, from a lion that wants to catch her and eat her. And if the gazelle doesn't run quick enough and fast enough, then the lion's going to catch her and she'll be destroyed. Similarly, the lion wakes up and he has to start running. He has to start running to catch prey so he can eat and survive. And if the lion doesn't run quick enough and fast enough, then the lion's going to starve and die. And this analogy, I don't know if you've encountered it, but I hear it a lot, this idea that we're running away from lions. And it's a comfortable analogy for people. They like it because it expresses a sense of linearity, of cause and effect. If I do wake up, I'm the prey, obviously, I'm the gazelle. If I do wake up and I start running, and I'm fast enough and I run for long enough, then I can outrun the lion and I'll be safe and I'll survive to run another day. And people like that. It gives you a sense of comfort to think there's something I can do, something definite and concrete that I can apply myself to that will improve my chances for survival. An analogy gets extended from there by arguing that I don't even have to outrun the lion. All I have to do is outrun the other gazelle, because if I'm running faster than the other gazelle, then the lion are going to catch the slower gazelles, and they'll get eaten and not us. right? So this kind of analogy shapes the way we think about security and sets people on a particular course. If we shift that analogy, we express what we do as security practitioners in a slightly different way, we can evoke other kinds of thinking. So for example, if I say to you, security is not like a gazelle running away from a lion, but security is more like running with the bulls in Pamplona, then I can evoke other ideas, right? Other ways of thinking. Running with the bulls is very much not linear. There's very little cause and effect. If you were stuck on that narrow road with 17 angry bulls and thousands of other runners, there's very little linearity in what we do. Rather, what you get is a sense of chaos, right? A sense of unpredictability. The sense that ultimately, no matter what I do, I'm going to get gorged by the bull eventually anyway. And I can't really predict which bull it's going to be, and I can't really change the probabilities by running faster or running differently, right? There's randomness and unpredictability. And that brings to light other ways of thinking. Now I stop thinking about what I do to protect myself, and I start thinking more about what I do when I get gorged, right? When I get compromised. So I start thinking about detection and response. And so changing the analogy changes the way we think and shifts the conversation. And there's one particular area where I think we use analogy to try and express what we do and why it's important. And that's in the language of risk. So when we talk to businesses, for the most part, we're talking about risk. And so I think risk is one of those, one of the analogies that we use in our space that really deserves to be examined, to be criticized, and maybe to be revisited. And we try all kinds of tools to express risk to business. And one very nice one that I found on the net is this idea of the doomsday clock, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. The doomsday clock is a simple mechanism that's used to try and express to outside stakeholders the size of the threat that they're facing and the likelihood that that threat is going to be realized. It's a very simple, very graphical way of communicating a complex idea to people to whom it matters, but that don't necessarily have the technical expertise to work it out for themselves. And in the same way, risk is the language that we try and use to express the urgency around security to our stakeholders, and particularly to business, and as I said, to society on a whole, and to the regulators and policymakers that shape the world. Now, risk generally has these two axes, two ways we use to try and quantify risk. We talk about the severity, so how bad is it going to be? You know, how much shit will we be in when things go wrong? And then the likelihood. So how probable is it that that thing is going to happen? And so we talk about severity and likelihood, and we try and express to our stakeholders just, you know, where the doomsday clock is, if you like, in terms of the security concept that we're trying to communicate. The problem with risk is that we're basically thumb-sucking. You'll see I've got a new tablet that's got a touch screen, and so I'm writing on everything now, just because I can. We're estimating these things. We're thumb-sucking these concepts. We don't have a way to concretely qualify them. And people much smarter than me in our space have been talking about this problem for some time now. You may know Alex Hutton. He's famous for his contributions to the Verizon DBIR, right, and the Veris framework. And Alex points out that really risk is this absolutely quintessential concept in what we do, and yet we don't really understand it, right? We haven't grokked it. We don't get it as an industry. Dan Geer, who everyone has to quote in a presentation because it makes you look smarter than you are, captures it a different way. He says, look, as an industry, we're able to roughly say that option X is better than option Y, but we're really in no position to try and quantify how much better X is than Y. And then I really like this quote from Richard Baitlich, who you'll know from Tau Security. He's the CTO at FireEye. He brings up this idea of what he calls physics envy. It's another concept that he stumbled upon. Physics envy is this tendency by other industries to try and assert that we have the same kind of precision, the same kind of scientific precision that you see in real sciences like physics and chemistry. And when we try and pretend that we've got the ability to quantify and express things in the way that the real scientists do, that's called physics envy. So Richard Baitlich says we're suffering from physics envy. Coming back to Alex Hutton, He asks a question on his blog, and incidentally, I highly recommend it. Look at New School Security. I've got a blog there. Some very smart people contribute there. He asks the question, so how do we rank? How do we rank in the family of sciences in terms of being able to quantify and express what we do? And his findings are pretty damning. Now, I will admit to sometimes forgetting to wear trousers. In the UK, you can't call them pants. You have to call them trousers. I'll confess that that's sometimes me. But on the whole, having been in this industry for almost 20 years now, I find this assessment of our performance pretty damning. It's a little bit miserable. And so I think there's an argument to be made that we can do better. And Parisa Tabrits from Google, from the Chrome team, expressed it very nicely in a Black Hat keynote earlier this year, where she said, let's fuck the status quo. It doesn't have to be like this. We can do better. And so I want to make an attempt to make this part of what we do a little bit better by talking about an alternative analogy, an alternative metaphor that we can potentially use to express what we do to business. And that's by talking about debt rather than talking about risk. Now, before I launch into this in too much detail, I need to make a confession. When this idea sort of started occurring to me, I thought I was very clever, and I immediately wanted to TM, get a brand name for my idea. I was thinking about debt copolyps, the security debt copolyps. And I thought it would make me famous. But of course, as is often the case, when I started actually reading and researching, it turns out a lot of people, again, much smarter than me, have been thinking about this much longer than me. And I need to highlight some of those people. The first is Ollie Whitehouse, now with NTT, was with Rex at the time, who wrote a paper about it in 2012. I forget this guy's name. Alfonso Barrera wrote an article about it, also in 2012. And then Chris Wysopal, who you might know as Walt Pond, he jumped in later with a number of blog posts on the Veracode blog. And then Dan Geer and Gunnar Peterson in 2014 wrote a very short, but I think very sort of powerful paper on the concept, which was published in on the Usenix forums. Now I'm going to be referring to these people and really shamelessly plagiarizing their work throughout my presentation. I would recommend that you go and find these papers if this topic interests you at all. There's some very interesting work. But really the idea begins with another guy, a guy called Walt Cunningham, who back in 1992 expressed this idea of what he calls technical debt. Walt Cunningham is famous for having developed the wiki. So if you use Wikipedia, that concept, the technical framework that's built on, was developed by Walt Cunningham. And he talks about this idea of early in the life cycle of a new development project going into debt. And you go into debt effectively by making shortcuts to achieve deadlines or add features at the expense of doing things right the first time. So at the expense of fixing the fundamentals, you rush ahead to some kind of outcome, and in doing so, you accrue debt. And he points out that that becomes dangerous when that debt is ultimately not paid. And that's because debt in technology, like debt in finance, accrues interest over time. And so over time, it becomes more and more difficult to pay that debt back. And I think we all know that to be true, right? We know that it's true that the later in the software development lifecycle we discover and address a bug, the more expensive it becomes. So it's something that's very clearly understood. Now, another guy that I came across in my research I'd never heard about before goes by the name of Melvin. He blogs and talks a lot about software development and DevOps. He talks about technical debt on his page, and he highlights sort of 4 high-level categories, causes of accruing debt. Things like making shortcuts, as I said, to hit deadlines, using old or unpatched libraries or frameworks, prioritizing features over, as I said, fundamentals, or making use of third parties, like APIs, for example, that themselves have got debt, that themselves have made shortcuts. Now, if any of you are in a sort of CISO, security manager type role, the CISO superhero, then I think some of these concepts are going to be familiar to you from the security space also, right? We see businesses making these trade-offs not only when they develop technology, but also when they assess and prioritize the need for the security recommendations that we make. And so the concept emerged, again, back in 2012 with Ollie Whitehouse and with Chris Wasopal, that we can think not only of technical debt, but we can think specifically about security debt, which is really the debt that's accrued when we make security trade-offs, not only in developing software, but also in the way we develop our infrastructure, the processes and the projects that we prioritize, the people that we hire or don't hire. All of those things can be thought of as accruing security debt. And so I want to spend a fair amount of time in my presentation today talking about this idea of debt and examining the value and the impact of using debt as an analogy over using risk as an analogy. And to do that, it's worth just spending a little bit of time on outlining what some of the concepts are. What are the elements of debt that we have to be aware of? What is the range, I suppose, that our analogy has to cover? So we need to start off by understanding there's debt versus credit. So that's borrowing versus lending. You've got the debtor or the borrower who receives the money. You've got the creditor who's giving the money. You've got the loan, which is really the contract that expresses that transaction. And the loan will talk about how much money is being lent, on what basis it needs to be repaid, so how frequently and within what time frame, and also what happens if the debt isn't repaid, right? So if I don't get my money, what do I get in return? There's the principal, which is the fundamental amount of money that's being loaned, that decreases over time as you pay it off. Generally, to favor the creditor, there's interest that gets paid as a premium on top of that loan. That interest is calculated as an interest rate, which is a percentage on the premium. And then that debt can be secured or unsecured. Mostly you're going to see secured debt, which basically means that the lender holds something of value as hostage for the case that the debt doesn't get repaid, right? And that thing that's held as hostage is something of value that's generally referred to as collateral, right? These are all terms that are familiar to you. Now, the reason I outline them is because I want to try and sort of clarify this analogy, the analogy between regular asset-backed debt, so that's the debt you'll be familiar with in your home mortgage, and security debt. So if we think about it from the top, what's actually happening is that a business is a borrower. The business needs resources in order to pursue its own objectives. So it goes to somewhere where there are potentially resources. And for the purposes of my analogy, that somewhere is going to be the risk mitigation function. So the risk mitigation function has people, has money, has budget, has time, has energy that it can invest in reducing risk, right, dealing with security problems. And the business goes and takes that away from the risk mitigation function in order to invest it into something else. Now, that something else may be technology, it may be people, maybe marketing, whatever else the business thinks is necessary. And the business is doing that in order to, in the future, generate some utility value, right? And that can be by spending on operational things, or it can be by making capital investments. And so, as collateral, the business is going to be using that future utility value that's created by borrowing from the security function is what's held hostage in case the debt is not repaid. Now, in a normal loan, debts have to be repaid on a regular basis. We all know that from our own mortgages. But in this case, in the security debt, because it's internal within a business, it's conceivable that the debt isn't repaid on a regular basis, right? The business decides when it's going to repay the debt. But I'm going to make the argument a little bit later in these slides that there are specific identifiable circumstances under which that debt must be repaid. So it can't simply be ignored. It does have to be repaid, just like other debt. And it gets repaid from the revenue or capital that's generated by the utility value that was created from the loan, right? And ultimately, that debt needs to be repaid back into the security function. As we know, that doesn't always happen, but as I'm arguing, sometimes it should. Eventually, it should. This concept of borrowing to create future value is what the finance guys call leverage. And this crowd called Better Explained, it's a site for kids and teenagers to understand difficult concepts, is what I used to understand the concept of leverage. So I'll give you an idea of where I'm operating. And they make the argument that leverage is a little bit like borrowing a cow and selling the milk. I really like this. So I go to Samil, who comes from India, and he has a lot of cows, and I say, Samil, give me one of your cows. I'm not going to pay you for it now, but I'll pay you back later in monthly installments. Then I milk the cow, I sell the milk, and from the proceeds of the milk, I repay Samil for his cow, and hopefully I take a little bit of profit. And that profit is what I gain by leveraging the cow. And this concept works very well, but the leverage has the effect of multiplying both the risk and the reward of that business operation. And you see it very nicely in this little calculator that I found. So if I used my own money and I bought a cow, and I'm hoping that I'm going to make twice my money back by selling the milk, then ultimately I've got on the upside the opportunity is that I can make twice my money back, and on the downside the risk is that I lose all my money, right? So I end up with nothing. If, however, I'm borrowing to buy the cow, then both the risk and the opportunity get multiplied. I can still make much more money than I had, but I also stand to lose much more if it goes wrong, right? I can end up not having the cow and not having any money and still having to pay Samil back for the cow that I borrowed, right? So that's the trade-off that you make when you leverage. So I think there's some advantages to using this debt analogy. If you accept that it can hold in security, then I think there's some advantages, and I just want to trot through those very quickly. The first is that it's concrete. Debt is something that shows up on a balance sheet of a business. It's there, and it doesn't go away. And it impacts in a very real way on business viability. So if you have more debt than you have assets, then I can make the argument that your business is effectively bankrupt, right? And I can do that based on the numbers that are present in your annual financial statements. And the business can't just accept that away. They can't say, oh, that risk is accepted, we'll ignore it. It's there, it's on the balance sheet, and it stays there until it gets repaid. And that in turn links directly into the fiduciary responsibility of the people who manage that business, right? The directors and the board of that business are held to account for what's on the balance sheet. And in real finance, that can have, criminal consequences for them if they're irresponsible with how they manage that. Debt is also transferable. That means it moves from one place to another doing certain kinds of transactions. And specifically, what it means for us is that if we buy or implement a technology that's developed by somebody else, then we inherit the debt that was accrued in developing that technology. And that has very powerful implications, which I'll touch on in a little bit. Debt, as we've noted, accrues interest, so it becomes harder and harder to repay over time. Debt can be paid off, and that's also very concrete. So as we invest in security, as we pay back these loans, the debt on our books becomes smaller. And debt can be extrapolated. So I can take an estimate of debt in one place and extrapolate what that means across, for example, an industry, across a sector, across a group of companies. Even in a country, I could say this country has security debt to this volume, right? It can be extrapolated in that way. But like all analogies, debt as a way of expressing security isn't perfect. So it holds in most accounts, but it has some differences from debt the way you would understand in your mortgage. And I'm going to try and express it with this diagram. So what you're seeing on the right there is what I'm calling the risk stack or the debt stack. And it just expresses the idea that I captured in that table earlier. Very simply that we have a risk mitigation function, we borrow from that function and accrue security debt, we leverage that debt to create utility within a business, that utility is used to create revenue, and that revenue is ultimately used to repay the debt, right? That's the debt stack. And it exists in every single business, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. As we saw with the cow analogy, leveraging can be very powerful. It's how we get ahead. So businesses are doing it all the time. It's acceptable and it's even good. What we have to realize, though, is it's not just us that's doing it. Everyone we buy from is doing it also. So when you buy a product, it has a debt stack like this in that product, right? And unless the debt in that product is repaid, it's going to continue accumulating interest, just like our own would. And every single piece of technology that we use within our environments has that debt stack, right? And so what happens is all of that stuff accumulates, right, all the way from hardware right through to the products that we run our systems on, have the accumulation of all the debt stacks from all the vendors and all the participants and all the contributors, right, bundled up into them. And that ultimately finds its way into our own debt stack. So when you're trying to assess what the debt level, the security debt level of the business, you can't just look at what that business is, the decisions that business has made itself. You have to recognize that you're also inheriting, in a linear way, all the other debt stacks made by the companies you work with, right? The systems that you that you consume and services you consume. All right, and that idea allows us to think in some different ways about security, and immediately brings to light some I think quite interesting new ideas to play with. And the first is this idea of accruing interest not only on your own debt but also on the debt that you've inherited from others. I slapped this together in Excel. This is not science. This is definitely guys riding on horses with tinfoil hats stuff. But I think it expresses the idea. What you see here is a balance sheet. It's a mock balance sheet of a business over time. And on the upside of that balance sheet, in terms of assets, you've got the technology or the utility value that I spoke about that the business has developed. And you've got the capital that that business then accrues as a result of having that utility value. Below the line, you've got the security debt, right, a liability that needs to be offset. You've got the interest that accumulates on that debt. You've got the security debt from the vendors, from the technologies that you take in, and you've got the interest on those over time. What happens, unless that debt is repaid, is that over time, the utility value decreases. We call that amortization, right? It gets less over time. But the interest accrues. It gets more over time. And not just your own, but also those of the vendors, if that debt is not repaid. And so what you see over time is that the balance sheet of that business shifts quite dramatically and in an exponential way away from being net positive to being net negative, which presents the argument that unless debt is being repaid in a business, that business is arguably bankrupt. They owe more than they have, right? And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I've seen businesses that we work with where we're presented with security problems that we're asked to help solve, where it becomes immediately apparent that that business could never afford to invest what it would take to achieve a tenable level of security based on how much they make, right? Their business model is bankrupt. And the only reason that they're still functioning in the world and not being run under is because they're not being forced to repay that debt. The cost is being externalized to others who are ultimately the victims of security compromises. And that's what we see happening with data breaches, for example, right? So that's the first interesting concept that emerges if we accept this analogy of debt. The other interesting concept that emerges is this idea that the debt is fully inherited. So not only do you take a part of the debt from your vendor, but you inherit the entire stack of that vendor. And those vendors are all connected together in a kind of a network that pivots around the shared technologies that they use, right? So if we take something like Spectre or Meltdown, what we recognize is that all of us are using a technology in the form of a CPU that has a degree of technical debt in it. It's a trade-off that the CPU manufacturers made, performance over security, right? And that debt is now in all of our stacks, and it connects us together in a way that exposes us universally to the same risk. So if something goes wrong with that CPU, all of that debt now sits on our books, and we have to suddenly deal with it. And what that means is that arguably, not just individual businesses, but entire collections of businesses, sectors that share technologies, either vertically or horizontally, are all laden, all tied down by this shared debt. And that's a very interesting concept, which is going to lead me to sort of the next part of my thesis. But before we go there, I've argued already that debt can be good. Leverage is used to grow businesses. It's a powerful concept. But when it goes wrong, the implications can be very scary. And to understand that, we must recognize that although it doesn't seem like within businesses we have to repay security debt, ultimately debt must always be repaid. And Ollie Whitehouse in their paper outlined a set of about 7 circumstances under which what they call forced repayment will have to happen. And it's things like client expectations. When you've been accruing security debt over time as a vendor, and for whatever reason your clients go, actually, we're not so comfortable with the level of security in your product anymore, or the level of security in your systems, we expect it to be done better, then suddenly you find that you have to go and repay that debt. You hadn't planned to, but now you have to take away from something else to go and repay that debt with its interest. When businesses recognize that it's getting too expensive to repay that debt, they may be forced to repay that debt at some point. When external capabilities evolve, in other words, or for example, when an exploit, a vulnerability that you didn't think was exploitable suddenly becomes exploitable, the debt that you've accrued has to be paid. Or simply when there's increased external focus. So you've written your killer app, you took a whole lot of shortcuts to get it to market, you've accrued a lot of debt, you didn't think security mattered, but now suddenly you hit the jackpot, 1 million people are using your app, and you're like, oh shit, I better get this right. You're forced to repay that debt. But I want to add to those 3, I think, simpler conditions that I think capture circumstances under which debt will have to be repaid. The first is when your business gets evaluated. I've sort of been in the startup space for a while, and one of the things that I've experienced is what they call diligence, which is when a buyer evaluates a business for purchase. And part of diligence is technical diligence, which is when they come and look at what you've got under the hood, and they say, how good is it? So you're making the argument that your startup, that has an online, internet-connected waffle iron is worth $1 million. And the evaluators, the due diligence guys come and have a look, and they say, yes, this waffle iron is worth $1 million, but guess what? You still owe $1 million on it because you've accrued security debt. So actually, your waffle iron isn't worth $1 million, it's worth nothing. That's the first circumstance. The second circumstance is what we're seeing happening with things like GDPR right now, where the government, as regulators, step in and say, we are not comfortable with the level of security debt that you're accruing. It's not okay. You're taking on too much risk, and it's not all right for you to externalize that risk to your customers anymore. We want you to square up. You have to settle your security debt now by making it right. And suddenly you find yourself under external pressure being forced to repay debt that you were happy ignoring previously. And the third circumstance is when the assets, so the utility value that you created by leveraging your security debt, goes toxic. Now, toxic is a concept that's borrowed from finance, and basically what it means is that the underlying asset suddenly loses value. It doesn't have utility for you anymore, right? It's worthless. And not only is it worthless to you, but it's worthless to others, so you can't even sell it off anymore. Nobody will take it off your books. Everybody wants to get rid of what they've got, and so what you see is a fire sale, people just selling it for whatever they can get, and the value of that thing continues to drop. And an example of where that would happen in security is, for example, in a big breach. You may find that Intel experienced a form of this because of the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities, where suddenly everybody said, we don't want to be in Intel anymore. We want to get rid of our Intel. We don't trust it. It has no more utility value. It's not worth what we paid for it anymore. We want to get into AMD or whatever the case is. And so you find that asset that they created suddenly becomes toxic. I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me capture it like this. Leverage is great until the cow runs off, right? So I've borrowed from Sunil, I'm using the cow to create milk, I'm using the milk to get money so I can pay Sunil, suddenly the cow drops dead, boom. Right, now I still owe Sunil the cow's money, and I don't have a way of generating revenue, and now I'm up shit street. And we see that very concretely in our own lives with the idea of foreclosures, right? So if I have a house, I suddenly can't pay my mortgage on the house. What happens is the bank comes and takes that house away from me. And depending on how the loan contract was structured, there are circumstances where the bank may even say, you know what, if the house today is toxic, in other words, not worth what you thought it was, and we can't sell it to recover what you owe us on the loan, we're going to keep coming for you. We're going to take your house, then we're going to take your car, then we're going to take your internet-connected waffle iron, or the PS4. Please, God, not my PS4. But they're going to come and fetch it all until they feel that that loan is repaid. Now, that's what happens in a single instance when one entity goes bankrupt. But what happens in that network scenario that I spoke about, when a whole lot of interconnected entities go bankrupt? Well, we've seen that before in the financial market with the financial crisis of 2007. This idea of CDOs, or collateralized debt objects. So what was happening there was someone would go to a bank, borrow money, to obtain a utility, a house, a car, credit card, whatever it is, what they needed. The bank saw that loan as an asset, and they would resell it. They'd say, there's something that we owe. I don't have it right now, but it's something that's owed to me, and I'm going to resell it. They would resell it to an investment bank, and the investment bank would then bundle the loans from a whole lot of different parties together into products, which then contained those loans, and resell them to investors, including you and me and the people who manage our retirement funds, etc. And that was all honky-dory. Everybody loved that until fundamental asset went toxic. And we all remember what happened when that happened. In other words, when they determined that the actual house that was borrowed wasn't worth what they thought it was, and they couldn't recover their debts, everybody wanted to get out of those products. There was a fire sale, and the whole thing goes down. And what we saw there was a collapse, effectively, of the entire financial system that started with the individual homeowners, the people they had borrowed from, the people who were building homes, the financial markets, and eventually the entire global economy collapsed because of the network effect that was created by these shared and distributed loans. And the impact was extremely severe. Global GDP growth dropped to -4% during 2009. Some estimates reckon that the irrecoverable impact on the global economy was $20 trillion over that period. So I got interested in this idea of whether, if we accept that the analogy of security debt holds, whether the concept of a financial crisis, or crisis like we saw in finance, could also occur in debt. And so I started reading, and one of the guys that I read is a guy called Timothy Geithner, who was the Treasury Secretary under Obama, but previously, in his role as head of the Federal Reserve, the New York Fed, also led the response to the financial crisis. And he highlights that in every case when there's a financial crisis, there's really three attributes. There's what he calls mania, or a bubble. There's what he calls excessive leverage, so too much borrowing and not enough repayment of that debt. And then what he calls runnable financing. Runnable financing is short-term financing that can be easily abandoned when things go toxic. So people drop it, right, in the form of a fire sale. And I started wondering whether security debt would have the same characteristics. And I started asking around, and I spotted this tweet by Rob M. Lee, who spoke about the potential of an attack on US infrastructure. And he mentions that what worries him is not so much the impact of the attack on the infrastructure itself, but the secondary effects of people becoming afraid and acting irrationally. And I asked the question, could that happen in technology? Could a run happen on technology like a run happens on financial instruments during a crisis? And a debate ensued around that with a lot of people weighing in, generally arguing that it probably didn't seem likely. But then Wim Reams piped in, and he drew my attention to something called the Sybil Logic Bomb Project, which is a research project by Cambridge University, by the Center for Risk Studies, in which they examine exactly this question. And they sketch a scenario where a single technology that's very widely used by major corporations, they use a database, a fictional database called Sybil, which I think is modeled on Oracle. And in their scenario, they talk about a logic bomb within this technology that effectively subverts or affects the integrity of the data that's in that database very slowly over time. And then they play out in their study what the impacts, the sort of primary, secondary, tertiary impacts of that will be. As people lose faith in the technology, they lose faith in the data that technology generates, they lose faith in the products and the processes that use that data, and eventually they start to abandon it wholesale. And not just that technology, but also the other technologies by that vendor, and similar technologies by other vendors. The market loses faith in all of those. And so it turns out that they sketch almost an exact, precise replica of what Geithner describes in his book. And where Geithner talks about runnable assets, the Cambridge guys talk about information malaise, which is basically this large-scale loss in faith in a technology or a technology stack because of the uncertainty caused by the initial breach, right? People simply say, we can't trust it anymore. We don't feel confident that it's good, and so we're going to abandon it. And they abandon it large scale. And then they track out the implications for that on the global economy by using sort of standard economic forecasting models. They look at what the economy could have done, and then they look at the impact on the economy if the scenario plays out. And they sketch 4 or 5 different models of, based on severity, et cetera. And in each case, the impact is significant on the global economy over time. So given the right kind of scenario, the right kind of technology, and the right severe enough impact, then the impact on the global economy over time ranges between something like $4 trillion and something like $15 trillion over a 5-year period. Now, according to them, that's comparable with an impact on the economy of $20 trillion during the global financial crisis. So the conclusion is that whilst this kind of scenario is highly improbable, it's not very likely to happen, it is absolutely possible. It may be a 1 in 100-year event, right? But you don't know which of those 100 years it's going to happen in. And when it does happen, we could be dealing with real shit, the kind of shit that we dealt with in 2007 because of the global financial crisis. Maybe not quite as bad, but pretty close. So it feels to me like this analogy, using debt instead of risk, is powerful and allows us to see our world in a very different way, think about what we're doing in a very different way, and consider the implications of not getting it right in a very different way. But at the bottom of that, we still sit with a problem that we had with risk, which is that quantifying debt, like quantifying risk, is actually still very difficult. And when I started talking to people about this, it was very quickly drawn to my attention that it's a nice idea, but until you can start quantifying debt, you really can't move the dial, as Arun said, move the needle on shifting the conversation forward. So I want to go back to those original papers and just explore very briefly how each of those players looked at quantifying risk. And I'm going to bring in here the guys from Melvin also talk about technical debt, not security debt, because they have some powerful ideas that I think we can learn from. So starting with Rex, they talk a lot about the characteristics of this debt, but they don't really go to much effort to present a model through which debt can be calculated. There are some concepts, though, that they introduce that I think we can leverage, excuse the pun. The first is that the interest rate that we use when we consider how debt accrues over time isn't necessarily fixed. It varies. And it varies depending on the kind of trade-offs that you're making. This is a concept that Melvin will bring in later also. They also introduced the idea that debt can expire. So for example, you can write a product off, like Microsoft does when technologies reach end of life. And they point out that Microsoft even makes a distinction between end of life and end of security life. And end of security life, what they're saying is, we've written that off, and by writing the technology off, we're also writing the debt off our books. It's gone. We're not worried about it anymore. We can strike it from the balance sheet. But that's about as far as they go. Chris Wysopal tries harder in his blog post, and he actually presents a model which he has examples for, and uses it to calculate numbers. His numbers end up being very big, as you can see. But his model requires us to have information that's very hard to get, and that is probably not within our reach at this point. And specifically, he's looking for a way to relate vulnerabilities in your systems to the vulnerabilities that were involved in actual breaches where there were quantifiable losses. And he goes on to say, well, look, that's going to be future work. And I haven't actually seen any future work by him on that. So he sort of shifts the dial a little bit, but really there's not anything that we can implement there. Dan Geer and Gunnar Peterson go much further, and they produce an actual model, which is both simple and I think practical for certain applications. And they use a concept which is, again, well understood in finance called margin of safety. And effectively what they say is, if you take what you invest in producing a utility and you subtract what you invested in securing that utility, then the difference is called the margin of safety. And the bigger the difference is, the less your margin of safety is, the more risk you have. And they describe that difference effectively as the leverage. And in their model, because the concepts are quite simple, they can actually come up with with an example. And they express the margin of safety as a percentage, the ratio between what you spent on securing something and what you spent on developing something, right? Now, that doesn't give you a quantifiable number that you can express on the balance sheet, but it does allow you to solve that problem that Dan Geer expressed early on, which is that you can compare two things together. So I think in this analogy, no, not in this one, but in another one they present, they talk about the margin of safety in a web application that's developed by a company versus the margin of safety in a mobile app that's developed by the same company. And they can calculate that the margin of safety is much higher on the mobile app than it is on the web app. And so they can say, we've done more here, and what we're doing on the web app is below, right? So they can compare, which meets one of the criteria that Dan Geer set for metrics within a science. But still doesn't really address our need to have something we can put on the balance sheet. And then the guys from Melvin look at it in a very different way, and this, I think, opens up a whole lot of doors for us. What they say is, let's express the need to address and pay off technical debt as specific projects on our roadmaps, and specifically as epics within a Scrum. And they start off by saying the first step in that epic, what do they call it again? A spike, is simply to calculate the amount of work that would be required to pay off the debt, right? Then you take that and you express it as stories within that epic, and then you add those to the roadmap. And so what it means in this limited scenario for a development manager is that they can say, this is exactly how long it's going to take us based on our development planning methodologies. This is exactly how long it's going to take us to pay off this debt. And because a business can then calculate what its development costs are, you would be able to attach a number to that, right? You'd be able to say, paying off this debt is going to cost us this much at this point, based on specific planning that we did. They also talk about the idea of grading the debt. So we're saying, let's use different characteristics, the severity, the occurrence, interdependency, et cetera, to prioritize the debt that we have to pay off, so that some is more important than others. And both of those ideas from Melvin's paper, I think, can be used in developing a new model. So I put my thinking hat on. There you see my pen again. Put my thinking hat on, and I've made an attempt, in the spirit of moving the needle, to try and come up with another model that I think can be used to quantify debt. And my model works like this. Let's start by simply creating and maintaining a debt register. So if you're a development guy, if you're a security manager, if you're a CISO, don't ask for permission, just do it. Create a debt register in an Excel spreadsheet and keep it on your computer. Then establish what I call a locus of control for security. So who is the person in your environment who's best positioned to determine what's the right thing to do? It doesn't have to be perfect. You just need someone who consistently say, I believe that to achieve a level of security that's appropriate for what we're doing, this is what we ought to do. That could be your auditors, it could be the regulators, it could be your pen testers, it could be yourself. It doesn't matter. It just needs to be someone who says, I think this is what's right. Then, every time a security trade-off is made within your organization, what you do is you calculate what the recommended path would have cost in terms of technology, time, human resources, whatever it might be, and what the actual path cost. You deduct the one from the other, and you end up with the debt, what's owed, right? And then what you do is you capture that in your register. So you say, for this project, the trade-off that we made, if I calculate what we should have done, and I deduct what we actually did, that's the debt. That's what we're leveraging, and I add that into my register. And if you want to be really fancy, you can play a little bit with the interest rates that you then apply to that debt. So I think you start off with something like prime. So what's standard interest on something in South Africa? What is it now? 5.5%? 7%? Do you know, at one point in South Africa, when I was first looking at buying a house, we were being charged 22% interest on a home loan. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. 22%. You guys don't even know what interest is. We know for interest. But whatever the interest rate is in your environment, you take that interest rate. And then what you can do is you can dial that up or dial that down a little bit based on the severity of the issue that you're looking to address. All right? Then what you do is, once you've got that register and you feel comfortable that you can express it, you start communicating it to your leadership. So in our case, my team develops a board report, which we submit to our board every day. My team's sitting in the front here. They're all looking panicked and tired from having to generate constant board reports. What I would do is I'd just start to express that risk register in the board report, just as a metric for the board to consider. And over time, I would crank up the rhetoric around that and start commenting on the amount of debt, what needs to be done to repay the debt, et cetera. In other words, just introduce it into the conversation. No doubt what will happen is you'll get pushback, you'll get questions, you'll get arguments about how you're doing it, and that's fine. You use that to refine your process, make it better over time, until you develop a language between yourself and your leadership that talks about the debt that's being accrued and the mission to repay that debt over time, right? Rather than just talking about risk. And then finally, we have to start having those conversations with our vendors also. Now, your vendors won't do this for you, I've no doubt. But if you're persistent enough and you keep pushing hard enough, then over time, I think we can see that way of thinking with our vendors also, right, with the parties we depend on. And there's an example that I slapped together in Excel with my absolutely unbelievable Excel skills. And you'll see the basic components are expressed. It's very simple, and I wouldn't recommend that you try and do this at home, but it sort of captures the idea. You capture the date, you know, where the trade-off was made, what project it affected. I've got some basic categories for the trade-off. I describe it. And then I have a grading on a scale between 1 to 10, which is what I use to crank the interest rate up or down. And from that, I captured what I call prime interest rate. So what's the standard interest rate that's being paid in my space at that time? In my example, it's 5.5%. I apply the grading to that standard interest rate to come up with the derived interest rate. And then I simply capture that trade-off the way I calculated it. So in the first line, I reckon the trade-off that was made there was cost £2,600. That's exactly what we didn't spend that I think we should have spent. And then over time, year on year, that accumulates interest until some of it's paid off. So when we do it, when we put that money in, then that decreases again over time, right? And that, I think, quite simply captures accumulated debt over time across all the security trade-offs that we make. I don't think it's genius. I don't think it's perfect. But it feels to me like something I could start having a conversation with my leadership about. No doubt, as I said, there'll be pushback, but it's a way to get the conversation started. So there you go. There's a model for calculating debt and introducing it into conversations with our leaders. So I want to end, in the little bit of time that I've got left, just with some parting thoughts. And the first one relates to this idea of the security debt crisis. And the question I want to put in your mind is, how many zombies does it take to make an apocalypse? Yeah, I just said that. And the idea is this. You're sitting at home on your balcony drinking a cup of tea, and you see a zombie walking past. There's a zombie. Like, oh my God, that's a zombie. But you don't panic. You don't panic because you know all that needs to happen is you need to beat the zombie with the baseball bat, and it goes away. And as long as there's one zombie, or one or two zombies, or a zombie here and a zombie there, it's okay, right? What we can't ignore, though, is the network effects of zombies. The fact that zombies infect each other, and the zombies multiply, suddenly at an exponential rate that we can't control anymore, right? That we can't predict anymore. And what happens then is we jump from having a handful of zombies to a zombie apocalypse at some point that I've never quite figured out who decides what that point is, all right? Who decides when is a bunch of zombies actually an apocalypse? And the analogy I'm trying to draw, obviously, is that we see these security incidents, these major breaches, these complete failures of security happening around us all the time. One here, one there, BA, Equifax, right? They're all happening. And it's easy to look at them all in isolation and argue that they're individual zombies and are easily addressed. But if we accept this network effect, if we accept this shared and accrued debt over time, what we have to recognize is that at some point, when enough of those happen in the right place, it suddenly becomes a zombie apocalypse. And that's a reality that I think we have to deal with. I just really wanted to say that. Okay, and then in concrete terms, here's the summary of my message. I think we're facing real threats. I think we're looking at a scenario in which the fundamentals of the world and the internet and our societies as we know and love them, the world that we want our children to grow up with, can be fundamentally changed if the right decisions around security aren't made. I think that means we have to address the way we talk about things and the analogies that we use. Alex Hutton, when talking about risk, he argues that we should rather look at immunology and the management of medical crises as an analogy for what we do, and I think that maybe has legs. I think that's something to be considered. Clearly, more has to be done around calculating security debt A few people have made, I think, relatively poor efforts, including myself, at moving that needle, as Arun said. I think more can be done in that space. But finally, my call to us is, let's try and introduce the language of debt into how we talk to people. Just start by using the word, and let's see how it shapes people's perceptions of what we're dealing with. And that's me. Thank you very much.